Welcome back to the live series podcast where we speak with leaders in the tech industry about their insights, challenges, and journey. It's Miranda Marshall here. I'll be your host today, and today I'm speaking with Samantha, who is the CCO at Dynelectro, and we'll be speaking about how to mitigate the cost within the energy sector, being a startup, which is a bit of a mouthful, but definitely very, very interesting. Not too much. I don't really know too much about this sector. So it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast, Samantha.
Great. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
No worries. And you're actually my first female guest within the tech industry. So really, really exciting for me as well. And hopefully many, many more to come. But yeah, I think we're going to start about mitigating costs within the energy sector. I know that you've got Dynelectro, which is a startup within the energy sector. So I think it would be good to understand a bit about Dynelectro, what you do first, and then maybe a little bit about your background as well.
Yeah, that's a great place to start. So actually the company name is Dynelectro. So it's actually, that's the Danish way of saying it's for dynamic electrolysis. So electrolysis is the process of taking water and converting it into hydrogen and oxygen. And so we add the dynamic bit to it, which means that instead of operating at, say, just a steady state, we're able to operate in a very dynamic, which kind of means movement way. And that's the bit that's unique from, say, conventional systems, which generally industries, like if you think of any device in your house, like it likes to have a steady kind of power input. And that just means predictability. It means your electronics and the internals can be based after a certain input. So that's the company. So we make, we make systems that make hydrogen in a very efficient way. That's the short bit of what we do. My background, actually, I studied mining engineering. And I worked in my father's mining businesses since I was an early teenager. Started out doing environmental sampling. I've worked underground doing surveying. I've worked in the labs doing the chemical assays on the materials coming out of the mines. And in general, any of the raw materials, if you look around, our cars, our computers, any of our electronics, all of those raw materials have to be mined. So it's very it's a very critical industry in the world we live in. And then I worked in research and development. I worked for a decade with Shell and, as I said, in the R&D sector. And then I've worked in Denmark, I worked in Australia, I worked in Dubai. I've had projects that took me to Malaysia, Africa, Scotland, Oman. So quite a lot of experience globally. And most recently, I ended up in Denmark. We have the highest amount of renewable energy in our electricity grid. We have 53%, which is a global high for any renewable energy. Maybe take several decades backwards. So since we're talking about costs in the energy sector, what's interesting, or keeping costs down, of course, in the development phase, is back in the 70s when there was the oil crisis, different countries had different responses to, the super high oil price, and you had high inflation. And one of the things that, say, Denmark did at the time was they heavily invested and heavily subsidized wind power. So this is why, say, 50 years later, Denmark has, the leading amount of renewable energy, primarily from wind energy, in their electricity grid. So, for example, like France, they heavily invested in nuclear, whereas Norway invested in hydro. So different countries had different strategies to address and mitigate the high prices back in the 70s. So where was I going with this? This was just, what does the company do and what was my background? So I'm literally kind of the energy corporate view in our company. We're just under 10 people, primarily academics, which makes sense. Where we're at is, I kind of like to say, like, we're at the pointy end of the arrow. And sometimes we're a bit earlier than that. We're like the air molecules that are moving ahead of the pointy bit of the arrow. So a lot of the things, like at least with getting funding and subsidized funding, is having the right timing. It has to be, say, early enough in the development that you can get public funds, but if you're too early, there's not enough, say, knowledge to know that this is where things are moving. So it's kind of this sweet spot. And our CTO is absolutely remarkable. Søren Jensen, he started studying in this field more than 20 years ago. So he's one of the global experts in his field. And if you look at any of the papers in our field, I mean, he's literally, he's one of the leading publishers in that area. So in that way, we complement each other with the, say, deep technical experience. With, say, I have incredibly broad energy sector experience. So yeah, so now we're actually just building some equipment and basically getting it field tested, and that's meant to be the short version of what we do in my background.
Yeah, well, you've had so much experience with materials, like resources, for a long time now, which is obviously very transferable with the mining, but obviously having that experience within Shell, going from those resources to where you are today, how important is it to have someone with your experience within your company?
Yeah, I believe that, honestly, I would dare say it's absolutely critical, because until you can understand even just the language and the vocabulary of what the corporate environment looks like, you're not going to be able to understand the market that you're moving into. So, and that tends to be the case, is there's just such a huge gap, or there's a known gap between, say, the academic focus and then the full business focus. So it's that startups to have this, I mean, statistically, 9 out of 10 startups aren't going to succeed. And it's not because they don't have a good technical concept. It is all of the other bits. It's the, having a business case, having an understanding of your social license to operate, figuring out how to, and I mean, I don't want to spin doctor a lot of the concepts, but it's basically taking the same raw materials and putting it in a way that's consumable and targeted for the audience who's receiving that information.
Yeah, you've put that really well, actually, because I feel like that analogy could probably fit any product out there, physical or like non-physical, non-tangible as well. And so how much money was spent on research before your product was actually made, or your prototype?
Yeah. Well, the company to date, so we're having our 5-year anniversary come this November, and we've received 5 million euros in soft funding, so in public funds, and then that same amount in equity funding in our partners. So, and we're literally just finishing the first working prototype right now. We have small scale lab prototypes, and those have been operational now for the last year and a half. So it's been quite a journey in that way.
Yeah, I mean, 5 million euros is like an incredible amount of money. I don't think some businesses would ever dream of getting that much, but I think it just shows how much money needs to be spent within this industry to create a big product. I mean, you're dealing with massive resources and important ones as well. So obviously you have generated that public funding. How did you generate it? How did you find it?
Yeah, and that's actually been one that I've learned a lot in, is because the founder is an academic. So public fundings and grants are, dare I say, it's the bread and butter of academia. And so the process is, for people who aren't familiar with it, is So for example, you have Innovation Fund Denmark, and each country will have its own innovation funding department, and they'll have what they call is a call. So they'll say, hey, we're looking for projects that fit this description. So there'll be a lot like in pharmaceuticals, there'll be a lot in, circular economy, there'll be, green energy, those are kind of big themes that they'll decide that they want to put money into. And then companies, including academia, small enterprises, and large companies, they will then put in an application for funding. And broadly speaking, universities will get a much higher reimbursement rate. So approximately, say, 80 or 90% of the costs will be covered. Whereas SMEs, so small, medium enterprises, we will have, say, 60% costs will be covered. And then if you're a large organization, you'll have 40% of the cost covered. So the balance of the funding is what you call is your contribution. So they're just making it an incentive that, we're not just asking for funds that are everything's 100% covered. It's just to make sure that it's, you have your own, say skin in the game, that you're making sure you're investing also in that.
I think that helps as well. Yeah, I think that definitely helps from that funding round, and it doesn't make sure that you're 100% reliant on that funding. So you do have to have some profitability pretty early on. Yeah,
exactly.
Which is always good. It shows that you've got a good, your prototype and your product is good, and it's going to be profitable further down the line as well.
Yeah. And I mean, and just generally, like, so the process started out like, I've been with the company now 3 years, and I mean, again, the amount of money that, like, if you look at our, say, the waterfall of the projects that we've had coming in, so for the first probably 4.5 years, probably for the first 3.5 years, it was just very small projects. And then we've had 2 or 3 now very large projects. So we're really following that exponential curve. So we would never get such large, millions of euros is absolutely, it's remarkable looking back at what we've accomplished even just in the last 3 years in terms of project funding. And it's now we're in a very unique position where, we're getting more projects coming in. Now we have to staff up and start to kind of accelerate some of our development plans because we actually have the resources to be able to do that. But sometimes it's a catch-22. But again, we started off with very small projects, and everything was bare bones. Don't know if you can see, but I'll show you. This was our table. You can see we're sitting on a and this is how we were working, is this on a converted, what do you call it, cable reel as our lunch table. That was like the first 2 years. Like, we've only now in just the last year expanded into having a proper desk each. We used to there's only 4 or 5 of us. We used to work on the same one table in the kitchen, and it was both our lunch table, our dinner table, and it was just everything all together. So being bootstrapped and being lean in the beginning, that's a huge part of keeping the costs down, so that you can get the traction, get the technical results, which will then allow you to kind of get the both equity investors and more substantial projects, which come with the cost sharing. So the reason why that's very attractive for a startup is, for example, when we first came here, we had a project for, what would it have been, 10 million kroner, so roughly, say, £1 million pounds. It's a very rough approximation. But since it was 60% funded by the government, we could go to an equity partner and say, look, you put in 40% of the funding, but you'll get 100% of the value. So the value proposition for our very first equity investor, it's a very compelling argument when you can get those funds matched by another innovation type of entity. So what I'm thinking as well too is there's a certain it's maybe just a whole other can of worms, but I'll try and do it in a sentence, is so these calls for funding from the government. So there's a whole art to actually writing these applications successfully. So once you get, and it's quite a high degree of scrutiny that goes into it. And so once you kind of getting those national funding projects is actually a very big deal because of both the scrutiny, and it also very much, it means investors who are, say, not detailed technical scientists, which they don't tend to be, they don't have to do a deep dive into the innovative and the newness of what we do, because I'm an engineer, and I work in, say, conversing with non-engineers. So, it'll be board members, it'll be state dignitaries, it'll be, primarily the private equity investors who are looking to invest. So they need to know enough about the engineering, but when they don't have an engineering background, then it's trying to find a way that makes them both comfortable with the technology without having to have an engineering degree.
Yeah, it's tough because I've always been one to say that jargon isn't the best thing all the time. I mean, it's good for in companies that know their acronyms and the jargon, but like you said, when you're speaking to it, and I think a lot of people get it confused with not using the jargon is to dumbing it down, and it's not that at all. It's making it accessible for everyone and making sure everyone can get involved with it. And I think that's a skill within itself to be able to explain something so complicated to people that are probably very, very interested, but some people just don't click with the natural resources and stuff like that, which is absolutely fine. Everyone's different.
Yeah. I just saw that was our two of our engineers walking between. So basically going to our prototype and then say, look, the engineering design work and the construction. So we're really lucky is all of those happen in one place. And our team is still small enough now that, so that what's happening in the construction phase gets fed back very quickly into the engineering, the design phase. So we do have a really closed loop. So we are, as many startups are, we're super nimble, and that allows us to do a lot of things on a short time frame. So that's one of the advantages of being in a small startup team.
Yeah,
sorry for the distraction. They just walked by. So
no, that's all right. Timing. I was actually gonna say that timing is everything, and especially with like generating funding. And I was going to ask you the question of how do you separate like the funding out to different departments? And I was thinking in my head before I asked it was that timing has a massive thing to do with this, because obviously the offices, you wouldn't have put a load of money into the offices on the first year, maybe even the fourth year. It had to be the fifth. So how do you, in your mind, when does that signal go off and it's like, now we need to shift the funding in a different department?
And this is probably where I feel I can contribute the most, because I've had so many different experiences, both globally and within different corporations. So I can at least see what, from the outside, what it's going to look like, because, and I'll just polarize the example. So so Jensen, our founder, as a very pure academic background, he's very much, show the science. And as an engineer, I'm like, absolutely, the science has to be there, but it also has to be packaged in a way that it's still consumable. So we still have to kind of get the balance right between it being not just the technology development versus also the messaging on how what does it actually mean? So, and I talk about spoon feeding it, like pretend I don't know anything, because like I know quite a lot within my field, but if I'm reading it, it's like, okay, there's a few things that there's just one or two words, like even if it's just, we plan to then make a, commercial scale operation in 2026, so that people understand that this is leading to something. So it's, it's just balancing who's going to be receiving it and making sure, I think that's the other art, and what we have to get is that the super detailed technical specialists have to be able to see and read or hear what we have to say, and it still has to resonate with, from a deep credibility point of view, but it still needs to have that high level, linking the dots between those deep technology points. Yeah, putting it all together.
Yeah, and I think from the few conversations that we've had before, and obviously speaking today, I think a big part of having someone like you on the team is personality as well. And you're very welcoming, you're very open, and you're very passionate about what you speak about, which is 100%, like I'd say it's probably 50% of what people take in and what people value the most. So yeah, if someone's very open and honest and willing to go the extra mile if someone doesn't understand something, I think it definitely makes the whole difference as well.
Yeah, I mean, and I can say, and I regularly, there's a few things I regularly say, but one of the things I really believe is that if you don't understand something, that's on me for not explaining it in a way that makes sense, period. It's not your job to know what I'm doing. It's my job to know your background, check in, and make sure that it's relevant. If I can't do that, I'm not doing my job. And it's just that simple.
Yeah, that's good accountability there. So going back to the departments, I know obviously time is everything. So what has been the most expensive department so far?
Yeah, good. That was what you were asking about. So basically where we spent most of the money is on hardware. So on the equipment we need to build. So like, you can probably, unfortunately, or maybe I need to move somewhere quieter, but like in our laboratory here, this is the ventilation, and don't know if you can actually see, but I'll just at least show you in case you can see. This is the testing rig that we bought and retrofitted for our unique purposes. So that was the better part of all of the money went into equipment. For the first couple of years, we all worked on reduced salaries in order to get it to a point where it was work, because we believe you have to believe in what you're doing. You simply do, because there are days when it's very hard, and yes, the underlying science and principles is so compelling that that future vision literally pulls me through the difficult periods. So, but sorry, you asked about where does the money go. So the money goes, I would dare say, if I actually pulled it out, I could get it down to the percentage, but I would say that for the first few years it was probably maybe 80% equipment, 20% salaries. Now that we're just under 10 employees, the split's probably changed a little bit. It's probably 30% salaries, 70% equipment, and resources.
It's obviously a change in, which is good, but I can imagine, I mean, I've never been near equipment that expensive or that big or that important, so I can imagine that it is crazy, and the risk of that breaking as well is a huge one.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just very broadly, that's also say where I at least bring my corporate experience in, is I know things about making sure you've got corporate liability insurance. I am thinking about, so as I said, we're making a container that makes hydrogen. Okay, well, what happens when we transport it to our site to Siemens, and something happens to the truck and it falls off the road? Like, where's the liability? Where does that sit? What happens from a pure safety rating point of view? So making sure that we have the right individuals who are making the right assessments, and that they're qualified to make sure it operates safely. So those are fundamental non-negotiables. It's front of my mind, especially with the background I have, is that we're the ones who do the safety, and when it's just to know your own qualifications and competencies, and to know where your boundary is, to know when you need external what's it called, certification on things.
Yeah.
So that's really, really essential, is making sure that, yeah, sometimes people don't know what they don't know. So coming from, say, high temperature, high pressure, flammable fluids so I've worked in offshore oil and gas fields. So it has, probably next to aerospace, it'll have the most stringent regulations from a safety point of view. So yeah, it is literally first and foremost. So I'm also, so in terms of both communication, external communication, board relations, I'm thinking about our safety, community engagement. So that's as I said, Son is super deep in his expertise, and I'm super broad in my exposure. So between the two of us, we do have a broad cover of, at least say the fundamentals to make a successful jump between an SME to a sustainable corporation.
Yeah, for sure. And if you could name a few points that have really helped you mitigate costs over the last 5 years or 3 years that you've been in the company that have been really important, like what should people be looking out for to mitigate costs?
Yeah, that's a great point. Again, so I think the first thing that comes to mind, at least, is salaries. So salaries tend to be a big part of costs. So start to look at, equity share in pulling people into what you're doing, because that's an important part. Other thing that we've actually done quite a lot of is buying secondhand equipment and then retrofitting it. So depending on what world you're able to kind of connect into, it's like we have, say, secondhand furnaces that we can use. Some things have a much, so let me show you how to save some costs. So secondhand equipment, even our desks and furniture, we're getting stuff off Marketplace. So just even like the Facebook, the free services.
Great site.
And it's also good for so many ways, not just for cost, but the question was specifically cost. And then this is another one where I at least remind my colleagues as well too, is like saying, just because something has a listed price doesn't mean you can't ask for, do they have any other options? Because sometimes the answer will be yes. So we've engaged in, instead of, purchasing material that we then go and do the, say, destructive testing on, we've made commercial arrangements where we've, as a service, offered to test individual manufacturers' materials with our, say, special bit, and to demonstrate the improved performance of the vendor's product. So so moving from a mindset of like proving the science versus like, okay, well, actually, why don't we make it into a service commodity? So really looking at it with a new, just a new lens of, can we turn this into a service rather than just purchasing things outright, asking for discounts. I think also creating partnerships. So it's also maybe easy inverted commas. It's more relevant in our business because we're doing product development, making something new, and we work within Power to X, which at the moment is a very it's an absolute growth area globally. So there's a lot of movement. There's a lot of players who want to upskill into that area. Now, because we have, again, a leading expert in the field, we spend a lot of time upskilling other people and other players into this area. So the other way to cut costs is to look and see if you can do an exchange. So for example, we'll do destructive testing in exchange for data. So rather than spending, 200,000 euros to buy equipment, because I mean, we're talking about very high tech precision equipment and that we're assembling in a unique way. And because these products don't yet exist. They haven't started building the factories for it. So there's just lots of nuances. So understand the market, understand things from your customer's point of view. So everyone looks at it from their point of view, like, oh, how can I get a cheaper product or a free sample? Put yourself in their shoes and say, well, okay, what would they need? So I put myself into like a manufacturer. It's like, well, they love the data because if it works, it'll be outrageously awesome. So making a business point for the recipient in mind, just not what I need.
Okay. No, that's really good. I'd never thought about that before. And like trading things is a really, really good way to do it. And that, I think that's really thinking outside the box. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily think that straight away. So I think that's really some really good advice. Is there anything that you would change with the benefit of hindsight over the last 3 years?
That's possibly, it's a very good course. I mean, the thing that I am observing is that in a startup, it's a little bit like, it's like a little bit like having a child at home. It creates, it's like it accelerates all of everyone's own, say, personal learning styles and backgrounds. So it really shortens the period of what you can learn about yourself. So I've learned a lot about myself and how I show up at work and how I engage with my teammates. So the question specifically is, what would I do different? What have I learned maybe?
Well, if anything, really. I mean, hindsight's a beautiful thing.
Yeah. It's a double-edged sword a little bit because I'm always reflecting on I'm like a continuous learner. Like, how can we improve? How can we improve? So I'm always asking, like, after we have team meetings or whatever, I'm saying, let's stay on, especially if we're meeting new clients and we're learning each other. We're learning how to engage with each other. And there's also cultural norms. Yeah. So I'm in Denmark. I've worked previously for a very established Danish corporation. That's Maersk. And so there's a very dominant kind of culture. So I'm now experiencing, say, a more academic background and approach. So I have to kind of learn my colleagues and they have to learn me. And there's, different people have different approaches and different people behave in different ways in stress. But what have I learned? Oh, I mean, it's really hard. Startup life is not for the faint of heart. It really isn't. So you have to truly, really believe in what you're doing and trust. I think that's what I've learned is that without trust, I mean, anything can be turned into, I observed something happening, but that wasn't very thoughtful activity, as opposed to, wow, Samantha must have had so much on her plate that, something has slipped off the plate. So it's a matter of keeping communication open. What have I learned? That's a whole different one. I'm trying to think. I'm constantly reflecting. So I'm trying to think if I probably, I'm maybe rambling on my answer because I'm both thinking of what I have actually learned. I think that you need a sounding board where you work. I think I used to try to think that I could be, show up at work and not mix personal stuff with work stuff.
Yeah.
And I used to be able to do that a lot better in a larger organization, but in a smaller company, it's actually, I think I probably maybe would have shown up as a bit more of myself a bit, but I think I had to get there with a bit of time.
Yeah, and do you think, obviously, with a startup, with a larger organization, you don't have the stress of a startup or those worries, so you probably have to do a lot less stress than starting a startup. So I think communicating and airing those stresses out, I mean, everyone's probably going through the same thing in the startup, so it becomes a bit more of like a community and you can rely on each other a lot more. But I definitely agree. I think it's really, really important having communication within work, a sounding board, especially when people are struggling. I mean, recruitment is a tough industry as well, so it's very easy to get caught in this frame of mind where you're the only one going through that, when there's obviously completely a lot of other people in the same position. So I think that's a really good point.
Yeah.
And what does the next 3 years look like for you then, for you in the business?
That's great question. So basically, as I said, we're building our first prototype at the moment. We're designing our, say, second and third iterations, all with public funding as well too, with our new equity partners. And we will actually have our prototypes in so we'll go to actually say from TRL 5 to 6, where we'll have our technology in a proper on-site environment. So whether or not that'll be at the Siemens test site or at the university or we have these hydrogen valleys. So it'll be where you're actually using real power, real steam and heat from byproducts systems. So then we'll have the test data, then we'll actually start to be able to optimize the the detailed power electronics side of things.
Wow, it's gonna be exciting then. I think it's gonna be a good 3 years or even a really good year. I think it's spring, isn't it, where you're gonna plan to get your first prototype out there, and then
that's
you
right.
get some test data and a real technology site, and from there. But it will be good to obviously catch up in a year's time and see where you are again. Maybe we can have another chat.
And I think as well too, I mean, it's maybe it's absolutely critical that we have the right people and the right competencies to be able to do these things, because that's kind of the space that we're in right now, as we're going from this very small team, is how do we upsize the organization with the right competencies and also the right culture and the right work ethic and the right approach, recognizing that it is it's a startup, so there's a lot of things that we haven't kind of completely worked out yet, and we're working it out as we go. So that component of getting the right people on board and onboarding them successfully and then retaining those people is probably as big of a challenge as building and getting the operational prototypes working properly.
I mean, it'll probably be taking 10% of your funding in the next year or so, or the next couple of years. So
absolutely.
I mean, values is definitely a good one to hire on. I know that obviously climate change is something that someone should be interested in coming into your company for sure. And I think there are a lot of people that are going towards that as well. But it's finding those right people that want to be in a startup as well. But I mean, you've done so well in the last 5 years that you're probably moving out of that startup area now and going into an SME, which is really, really good. And so that becomes a lot more attractive to a lot of people. So perfect. Well, it's been amazing to speak with you. I've definitely learned a lot. I hope some of our listeners have too. I mean, they might have some questions. I'm sure if they do, they will reach out to you. But it's been absolutely amazing to have you on. And I wish you say your name, your company name again? I'm gonna have to get this.
Dynelectro. You can say
Dynelectro
with it. So it's a bit of like potato. So I'll say Dynelectro, but Dynelectro is very, very fine.
Well, I wish you, the team, and Dynelectro all the best over the next years or so, and definitely probably have a catch up in a year or so and see how much has changed, because I'm sure there will be a lot that has changed.
Absolutely. Great. And thanks for the insightful questions and giving me a chance to kind of think about some of these very specific things within the context of what we do here.
No, it's always good to reflect and have a look. And if anyone would like to get involved with podcasts, obviously you can reach me on LinkedIn and also on my email, which is miranda.marshall@amicusjobs.com. But thank you so much for coming on, Samantha. Bye.
Okay, thanks a lot and good luck. Bye now.
Bye.